You know that feeling when you wake up already a little tired, even if you slept enough? Nothing dramatic happened, there's no clear reason, but your mind feels crowded before the day even begins. You check your phone, scroll for a bit, switch between apps, maybe open something you meant to do yesterday, and somehow within minutes you feel behind. Not physically exhausted, just mentally full. And it's confusing, because from the outside, everything looks normal. You're functioning, you're showing up, you're doing what you're supposed to do. But underneath that, there's this quiet sense that your energy is leaking somewhere you can't quite see. A lot of people get labeled for this. Lazy, distracted, unmotivated, addicted to screens, not disciplined enough. And when you hear those labels often enough, it starts to feel like a personal failure, like you're the problem that needs fixing. But what's actually happening here isn't a flaw, it's a pattern. And more specifically, it's something a lot of people are experiencing right now without realizing it. This is what Gen Z burnout often looks like. Not the dramatic kind people usually talk about, not the kind where everything collapses and forces you to stop, but the quiet version, the one that hides inside normal days, the one that doesn't announce itself as burnout at all. Because there's more going on here than people realize. When people think about burnout, they usually imagine overwork, long hours, high pressure, physical exhaustion. But for many people today, especially those who grew up in a constantly connected environment, burnout isn't coming from doing too much in the traditional sense. It's coming from never fully stopping. Your brain was never designed to process this many inputs at once. Every notification, every scroll, every quick switch between tasks, it feels small in the moment, almost harmless. But neurologically, each one asks your brain to shift attention, to reorient, to decide what matters. And those shifts have a cost. There's research in cognitive psychology that shows something called attention residue. When you move quickly from one thing to another, a part of your mind stays stuck on the previous task. It doesn't fully let go. So even when you're doing one thing, a part of you is still somewhere else. Now imagine that happening dozens, sometimes hundreds of times a day. You're not just tired because of what you're doing. You're tired because your attention never gets to settle. There's also the dopamine layer. Every time you scroll, refresh, or check something new, your brain gets a small hit of anticipation. Not even reward, just the possibility of reward. And over time, your brain starts expecting that constant stimulation, which makes stillness feel uncomfortable. Focus feels harder. Rest feels oddly restless. So you end up in this loop where you're constantly engaging, but rarely feeling restored. And that's where the confusion comes in. Because technically, you're not overworking, but your nervous system doesn't measure effort the way we think it does. It measures stimulation, and right now, it's overloaded. This doesn't start randomly. For a lot of people, this pattern formed gradually, growing up in an environment where being connected wasn't optional, where information, expectations, and comparisons were always present. You didn't just use the internet, you lived inside it. And over time, your brain adapted to that environment. It learned to scan quickly, to switch fast, to stay alert to what might come next. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. In many ways, it's a survival strategy. Because when your environment is constantly changing, constantly updating, constantly pulling your attention in different directions, the brain learns to keep up. But the same system that helps you stay responsive also makes it harder to slow down. And that's where the quiet burnout begins. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your system has been running in a high input mode for too long. It's important to say this clearly. This isn't better or worse than how previous generations functioned. It's just different. Every generation adapts to the environment it grows up in. Some learned to endure physical exhaustion. Some learned to manage long-term stability and routine. And some, like yours, learned to navigate constant information, rapid change, and invisible pressure. There's no right version of this, just different trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs here is subtle. You become incredibly good at consuming, switching, adapting, but it becomes harder to feel deeply engaged with one thing, harder to feel fully rested, harder to feel like your energy is truly yours. There's also a quieter layer most people don't talk about. This kind of burnout doesn't always feel like stress. Sometimes it feels like numbness, like you're doing things but not fully in them, like your reactions are slightly delayed, your thoughts slightly scattered. Not because you don't care, but because your system is protecting itself from overload by turning the volume down. And strangely, that numbness can be mistaken for a lack of motivation, when in reality, it's often a sign that your mind has been processing too much for too long. But there's another side to this. The same brain that feels overwhelmed by constant input is also highly aware, highly perceptive, able to pick up patterns, emotions, and shifts in ways that aren't always obvious. That sensitivity is part of the same system, which means this isn't just a limitation, it's also a capacity. The challenge is, right now, that capacity is almost entirely being used for reacting instead of choosing. And that's where the quiet cost shows up. Not in dramatic breakdowns, but in the slow feeling that you're always slightly drained, slightly distracted, slightly disconnected from your own energy. If any of this feels familiar, there's a good chance there are other patterns in your experience that haven't been named yet. Not problems, just things that make more sense once you see them clearly. And sometimes that clarity changes more than you expect.
Thanks for taking the time to watch this video.